مساء الخير. كيفكم شو أخباركم؟ So, hopefully this will come. Oh, I see what happened. Okay. So, thank you for that introduction and for your invitation. I just wanted to thank Dr. Abiyad, Kathleen, and the Center for inviting me to come out. I just wanted to say I'm really impressed by organizations like Sultan Qaboos for trying to make literature, and especially Arabic literature, more available to a broader audience. So thank you, this is a really great opportunity. My topic tonight is Dust's Embrace, al-Maʻarri and the Art of Dying in Classical Arabic Literature. And I wanted to begin with a quote, not from a scholar of Arabic, but rather a Shakespeare scholar. And the quote is this: "When there is an imagination of happiness, death is a scandal." So let the grim implications of that sink in for a moment. This is Shakespeare scholar and book critic Frank Kermode writing in the London Review of Books. I point this out because this is the general attitude that Maʻarri takes to his poetry about death, and we'll talk about that shortly. But not without a purpose. So in a lot of his writing, death is right in everyone's face. It's right in the reader's face, certainly. But the purpose there is to remind us not of death so much as how we're supposed to live our lives. And keeping death in mind is a tool to living a more ethical and moral life, which I hope to talk about shortly, as I said. So with that in mind, just a quick breakdown of how the talk will go this evening. For the first 6 or 7 minutes, I'll give a brief introduction to al-Maʻarri, who he was, his life and his works, and also the concept of zuhd, which some of you have heard of, some of you have not. And then after that, the bulk of the talk will be about the poem, which you have copies of before you. This is a very well-organized event, by the way, very impressive. So, to begin, al-Maʻarri and zuhd. So, al-ʻAla al-Maʻarri was born, as his nisbah suggests, in Ma'arif al-Nu'man. It's 70 kilometers outside of Aleppo in modern-day Syria. He was blinded at age 4 from smallpox, but despite this, showed an early precocity for language and poetry especially. When he was about 30 years old in 1003 Common Era, he took a trip to Baghdad to make a name for himself as a poet. At the time, Baghdad was kind of like Hollywood. If you were a poet, you went to Baghdad to make a name for yourself. If you're an actor, you go to Hollywood to make a name for yourself, right? For whatever reason, he was there for 18 months, and for whatever reason, found himself with enough reasons to return to his hometown and never leave again. Pre-modern biographers speculate as to why. There's many reasons. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you like. But nevertheless, he lived a secluded lifestyle, an austere lifestyle, typical of sort of the impression that we get of someone who practices zuhd, which we'll talk about in a moment. But he was also a teacher and a public intellectual. People came from all over the region to study with him. And he died at age 85 and was mourned by many. In terms of his works, two of the most famous, the first is a collection of poetry called Luzūmīyāt, self-imposed necessity is how it's sometimes translated. It's a poetry of zuhd, but also wāz, which you could translate as pious counsel, but also rationalist critiques of religion, sort of world hatred is another common theme, talks about animals not infrequently, and some of these we'll get to with this poem. I chose it because it's a good representative example of the kind of things that he talks about. Another very well-known work is Risalat al-Ghufran, the Epistle of Forgiveness. This is what one scholar called a work of eschatological tourism. It's a journey through heaven and hell in which he meets poets who supposedly were heretics, but who have been vindicated and forgiven, hence al-Ghufran. So two other works that I wanted to mention that are not as well known. One is al-Fusul wal-Ghayat, paragraphs and periods, roughly. It's a work of praise for God, temjid, and also pious counsel. It was also alleged to be a parody of the Qur'an, a very dicey proposition, if that were true. The other work is a short work. It's called Malqa Sabil, the Crossroads, referring to the fact that it's a work of prosimetrum, meaning a mix or a cross between prose and poetry, on similar themes of Luzūmīyāt and many of his other works. So since we're talking about zuhd, I want to ask, what is meant by zuhd? It has been variously translated as asceticism, renunciation of the world, even piety, broadly construed. The reason is that the word zuhd can refer to many different things. It can refer to sort of specific practices of living a certain way, only wearing very simple clothes, sleeping on your prayer mat, as Maʻarri was purported to do, living an austere lifestyle, but it can also refer to a general worldview and attitude. It can refer to an end goal, and it can even refer to a community of people who were practicing certain types of living. The core of zuhd for me is what I'd call educating the will. And there's an ayah from the Qur'an that shows up quite often in works of zuhd to summarize this. It's from Surah Al-Kahf. We have placed all that is on the earth as an ornament thereof, that we may try them, which of them is best in conduct. So the idea is not that you're to reject the world and to reject everything about it, but rather to put it in its proper place. You're meant to learn how to want or desire the right things in the right proportion and for the right reasons. If you want a sort of comparison with other religious traditions, you could look at the Buddhist Noble Truths, especially 2 and 3, talking about taming the will or becoming indifferent to the things of the world. Also the statement of Jesus Christ in the Gospel of Matthew, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Another thing that indicates to me the expansiveness of zuhd as a concept is the number of genres that it shows up in. The Qur'an and hadith are, of course, a basis in this. Every collection of hadith and also manuals of fiqh and ethical treatises all have a section of zuhd, if not the entire work being on zuhd. In addition, tarajim, so biographical entries of various learned scholars and others, ulama, sermons and poetry, which we'll be talking about, in belles lettres, arts prose, roughly. And then some common elements when we're talking about zuhd, including difference to superficial aspects of mortality. This is summed up in the Arabic phrase qisr al-amal, so the abridgment of hope, the cutting short your hope for the things of this world, the implication being that you're looking to the next. Doing without, zuhd is linguistically opposed to raghba, which is a kind of desire. It's a desire for excess. Scruple of conscience, the word here is wara'. And then finally, trust in God, tawakkul. Even the grimmest poetry with descriptions of graves and bodies and things like that, the implication ultimately about zuhd is that there is a trust in God and a reliance on His blessings behind this kind of looking towards death and even hoping for it. So there's a saying attributed to Shaqiq al-Balkhi, which is a human being cannot cope with zuhd unless he trusts God. So that's the implication. Okay, so I want to focus now on sort of literary and especially poetic discourses of zuhd. The foregoing points were made mainly to draw attention to the fact that zuhd is a very broad category, and today we're only talking about one aspect of it as it shows up in literature. There is overlap, but there's also some differences. So if you look at pre-modern literary anthologies, you'll see zuhd lumped in with other sort of genres and themes. They include describing youth and old age, dyeing your beard with henna, infirmity, illness, death, elegies, and consolation over death. So that gives you kind of an index of the different ideas and themes that might be there. And then in terms of specific motifs, some Latin coming at you pretty fast. The first is ubi sunt, where have they gone? This is referring to past peoples who were once mighty and powerful, who've been laid low by time and by death, as a reminder that all things on this earth pass away. A second concept is very relatable to the first, memento mori, remember that all must die. And we'll see this in Maʻarri's poem. And then the third is contemptus mundi, kind of world hatred. This is a contentious point among authors of zuhd. Some people would say this isn't a necessary aspect of practicing zuhd or a zuhd kind of outlook. Clearly it shows up a lot in poetic discourse about zuhd, and especially in Maʻarri. So it's not without some polemic. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to al-Maʻarri's life and works and also the idea of zuhd. Now on to the main event, this particular poem, which is Luzūmīyāt number 55, again from this work of poetry called Luzūmīyāt. And I have it up here, and if you want to follow along on your sheet, you can toggle back and forth between the paper and the screen, however you'd like to do it. So what I want to do first is just kind of read through the whole poem in English, and then go through line by line and talk about interesting features, whether linguistic or rhetorical or literary. If in the Q&A you have questions about it, again, we're going through Arabic for sake of time, going through in English for all the quotes for sake of time, but I'm very happy to sort of wrangle over the Arabic. One of my favorite things about giving talks like this is getting feedback from people who probably know more about it than I do. So, souls that crane the neck. And I'll read the first line in Arabic just to kind of give you a sense, and then the rest in English. نفوس للقيامة تشرئب وغي في البطالة متلئب. Souls that crane the neck toward judgment day, yet here, a crooked man, erect in foolish vice. You refuse to do any good, but you still prepare for a day that brings forgiveness. Don't be duped by the smile of a friend. His inmost thoughts are all of hatred and fraud. And people, whether young or old, grow gray in error or else grow up in it. Unwisely, you fancy your debased mortal life, but it never grants what you want. Since the time your soul became lusty as a camel, you have jaunted and strolled in error. And while the sleep of mortal life might be long, yet there is awakening for those who slumber. Craving the harlot equals languor and sorrow. The odd tryst does not satisfy him who aches with hot passion. Though Saturn's blackness might be your palm's dye, and dimly lit Alcor a stud in your ear, yet no supreme light or abiding wealth will save you from the unsure fortunes of night. Nor vigor ward off the dust's embrace, though the darkness be a veil atop you. I find the nightfall fuller winged than the crow, but even its pursuing black raven will die. So what bothers Aquila such that it won't fly there, and clinging Scorpio that it won't crawl? Does the day show an onlooker the sun after it's dawned, when that dawn is cloaked in mist? No well-wrought words could refute the death of Socrates, nor could the healer's art shield Hippocrates from it. If you see me brought low at death's brink, leave me be, for all who hope will perish. Nor shoo the bird from me, nor let your hand moisten this mouth, bone dry. So that's the poem. Speaking of bone dry, an occasional drink is good for the speaker. And now to go through each line. So the meter is wāfir. It's a common meter in sort of heavier topics, epic, heroic poems, this sort of thing. Some more serious topics appropriate for this. To note, though, Maʻarri uses every single meter of the 16 Khalilian meters, the sort of codified meters of classical Arabic poetry, in this work, Luzūmīyāt. The title itself refers to double rhyme. Maʻarri has a penchant for verbal acrobatics, so he uses double rhyme throughout the whole thing, meaning the second two letters of the end rhyme word rhyme, not just the first one, which is the normal convention. So it's a very strict way of doing the rhyme, and he has other things like this too, which we'll see. So in the first line, we have an instance of what's called tibaq, antithesis, and this is kind of putting two opposites together for a certain effect. Maʻarri often does this when referring to death, and it's expressing the idea of death as a great equalizer. Rich and poor, young and old, all come, powerful and weak, all come together in the grave. So here it's no different. We have souls that are craning the neck sort of horizontally, like this, and then an errant or person in error standing upright in his foolish vice. So you have this sort of perpendicular opposition. Going along with this is the word al-Qiyamah. So Yom al-Qiyamah is a very common term for the day of judgment, the day of resurrection, literally. But this word Qiyamah, literally rising up, adds to this image. So I have another line from Maʻarri from another Luzūmīyāt, another poem, also using tibaq. In the grave, mother and daughter meet, and equal are the horned and unhorned ram. So a third point on this line that I wanted to mention is the theme of error and hypocrisy. This is another one of Maʻarri's favorite themes. The word here that we see related to that is ghay, so a person in error, and we'll see the word al-ghawaya later on, also referring to this, and there are several words throughout that touch back on this theme. So for line 2, a couple of items here. Jinas. We'll see jinas in almost every line. This is root play or paranomasia, puns, but not really. Puns, sort of, but it's more referring to like sort of etymological play. Here, it's an interesting instance of this. There's the word ta'abba and ta'ib. They don't come from the same root, but they look like they do. So this is a kind of jinas called jinas mushabih. So like, kind of like jinas, looking like jinas, but not properly speaking jinas. Another word that stuck out to me is al-ghufran. Probably not a self-reference to this Risalat al-Ghufran, the Epistle of Forgiveness that I mentioned before, but it's a word that resonates in Maʻarri's nonetheless. And then again, the theme of hypocrisy and of error. So here is someone who refuses to do good, but still expects good reward, which Maʻarri does not like. Line 3, again the theme of error and hypocrisy. The word here is la yaghrurka. Could refer to al-ghurur, deceit, or also al-ghirra from the same root, which is heedlessness. And so for Maʻarri, the root of error, the root of going astray, is being heedless, not paying attention, which is what he's trying to do by pointing out the fact that we're all going to die, by pointing out the fact that this earth passes away. Another thing that we see here is rejection of false praise. Maʻarri, in another line I have up here, so here in this line of our poem, he's telling the reader not to accept false praise or even the false smile of a friend. Elsewhere, in another Luzūmīyāt, he says, I shun praise from a man even if he were truthful, so how could I bear lying praises and flatterings of me? And interestingly, in the Arabic, he uses the word zuhd, or the verb azhadu, to describe his attitude towards false praise. So it's not just wealth or superficial, the kind of material things of this world that one rejects when one does zuhd. It's also false flattering. Root 4, another instance of jinas between yashib and yashib, jinas mushabih, so not quite the same root. Also, tibaq and parallelism, the word for parallelism in Arabic would be muqābala. And here there's sort of a balancing of themes as well as individual words. So here we have a young person and an old person, and also the going gray of one's hair when you get old versus sort of growing up, becoming a shab. Yeah. And again, the theme of error, referencing back to line 1. Here we have al-ghawaya, going astray, and the word from the first line, an errant person. Okay, so line 5. Yet more jinas. Sorry to tub thump away at this, but jinas comes up quite often in Maʻarri's poetry. This is jinas tem. The word repeats itself, tuhib and tuhib, and probably the first sense means, so someone loves this fallen world or this debased life. So crave, desire, fancy, that kind of thing. Similar meaning, but probably more like hoping for or expecting in the second one, but it's a very fine line. Another word that stuck out to me is the verb jadat. In pre-Islamic poetry and early Islamic poetry, this refers to rain. Rain jads. It gives itself. The skies give good rain when people look for it out in the desert. And it comes to mean, therefore, any material generosity. It's often used also as in reference to patrons in praise poetry. When the poet asks for a little something, it uses this word here, referring to this world and how, despite all the reader's desires, it doesn't give these sort of superficial material things that he or she wants. Another phrase that comes up a lot in zuhd, and indeed in the Qur'an and other sort of pious texts in general, is hayatika ad-dunya. I have 2 verses up here from the Qur'an that I always think of when I see this. This debased life is but a trifle, a game. Ma hadhihi al-hayat illa lahwun wa la'ib. Yeah? And the other one is from Surah Ar-Rahman. All that dwells thereon shall perish. Kul man alayha fan. Interestingly about these verses, these always come up in zuhd discourse. It's important to keep in mind how they end. In the parentheses below, the first verse from Surah Al-Ankabut, the final abode, that is life. And then in the verse from Surah Ar-Rahman, there remains the face of your Lord, majestic, splendid. So always there's this implication whenever zuhd discourse talks about the finality of death and the transience of this life, there's this implication that there is something enduring. And that's important to remember because Maʻarri, at least in these poems, sometimes doesn't say that. He says it in other works, but it's easy to forget that that's also an element here. In line 6, an interesting word, ants. This is a rock. It also refers to a kind of like sturdy, lusty young camel. And it's also the root of one of my favorite words from form 12. For those of you studying Arabic, there are forms beyond the first 10, if you didn't know that. And the word is i'nawnasa. The she-camel's tail became long and full and ample in its hair. So I challenge you to use that in your homework assignments if that's appropriate. Also, talking about the soul as a mount. This is a common sort of theme from pre-Islamic and early Islamic poetry, identifying a person with the mount. There are these long sort of camel description sections where the implication is that as the poet thinks about his beloved, he identifies that beloved with the camel, the sheen of its fur, the way that it walks, the strength of its muscles, and other things like that. But here, the camel is being identified not with so much the look of the beloved, but with the poet's own soul, or with the reader's own soul, I guess. And again, another repetition of the theme of error, dalala and takhub. Looking back at line 3, the word khib shows up there from the same root. Line 7, another instance of jinas between ruqad, sleep, and raqidin, those who sleep. And here comes, in this line comes another common trope in Maʻarri's poetry, which is mortality as sleep and death as waking. So in this life, we're kind of going through a long nap, and then finally, when death comes, we wake up from it. Sometimes it's reversed, and I have another line up here from another of his Luzūmīyāt to this effect. Death is a long, endless sleep, and sleep is a short death that is soon cast off. So there are some stakes for belief in this line. Because of statements like this, some people accused Maʻarri of kufr, because the implication for those accusers is that he doesn't believe in the resurrection, meaning that once you go to sleep, or once you die, you go to sleep and you never arise again. That is a possibility. It could also be a symbol or a metaphor. But the fact is that he took some heat for this and statements like it. Line 8, a great image, very common throughout Maʻarri's poetry. The world is a whore, which grants favors only occasionally. I have 2 lines up here that sort of resonate with this particular line. One is from Maʻarri's early poetry collection, Saqt az-Zen, the first Tinder spark, or the first Tinder spark, sorry. And written on the common theme of comparison between a beloved stingy with kisses to a miser stingy with money. And so here Maʻarri is presumably using this trope to ask for something from a patron, but could also be an actual beloved that he's addressing. Even the miser, if the utmost in generosity is brought to him, granting a gift to the beggar should cause him no hardship. And the second line refers to, or has in it, a phrase that Maʻarri often uses to describe the world, which is dafar, mother of stink, or mother of stench. And here's the line from his other poem. I've rebuked you, mother of stink, so listen to me, and permit me this rebuke, or else leave me alone. So here's the theme of world hatred, contemptus mundi, which again, not everyone who does zuhd or writes about zuhd would say is an essential part of it, but for Maʻarri it certainly is. Line 9. Here we see another thing that Maʻarri does, another trope or another thing that Maʻarri likes to do, which is to use references from learned disciplines. So the references here are from astronomy and astrology. He also draws a lot on law, fiqh, on grammar and prosody, and medicine even, and other topics like this. So just a couple of quick notes on this line. Sawad, referring to Saturn, K1, can refer to any deep color. So sometimes it's black, sometimes it's green, and I've seen commentators even suggest that it can also be like a deep yellow. Suha is the name of this star, not as famous as Saturn, presumably. It literally means forgotten or neglected, but it's known as Alcor. And it's a star paired with another star called Mizar and the handle of the Big Dipper, and it's known for being a very dim light. The two of them together make kind of what they call a naked eye double. So if you look at it without using a telescope, they look like they're pretty close together. And the general sense of this is your desires can reach even up to the stars. You can want everything that this world has to offer, including the heavens themselves, but that won't save you. Line 10, another instance of tibaq, antithesis, a couple of instances actually, looking at opposites paired together. So nights and light, vicissitudes, things that change, the changing fortunes of night or unsure fortunes of night, versus something that's abiding. Interestingly, the word abiding here, Maʻarri uses about wealth, which for him is never abiding. So it might have this ironic sense as well. And here, that brings us to another point, which is Maʻarri generally expresses an ambivalence towards wealth. So on the one hand, there are lines like this where he says, not even the most abiding wealth can save you from inevitability, inevitable demise. On the same token, he has other lines like in another work called Risalat as-Sahil wa Shahij, the letter of the horse and the mule. Spending in good causes is more welcome than sympathy. Al-infaq aqbalu min al-ishfaq. So again, this is a point of contention in zuhd discourse. Is wealth a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it neutral? Some people would say it's a bad thing on its face. Others would say it's not the wealth itself, but how you use it and why you want it that matters. Line 11, more jinas, tasabba and sib. So the verb tasabba comes from the root meaning imprisonment, capture, this kind of thing. So on the one hand, you have the sense that like death or the night, inevitable demise captures you like a prisoner. On the other hand, it has sort of a positive sense of being captured, to be captivated by something. And this is something else that shows up in Maʻarri quite a bit, which is ambivalence towards death. On the one hand, it's something that people fear. On the other hand, for Maʻarri, it's a welcome respite. It's a rest from the pains of this life. Number 12, another instance of jinas between junh, nightfall, and janah, wing. The general sense of this line is that the night will pass away just as surely as the day does, no matter how black the night, no matter how strong, and no matter how quickly it comes out. And here also an interesting image of the raven, the ghurab. In pre-Islamic and early Islamic poetry, this is a trope of separation. So ghurab al-bayn is, strictly speaking, a bird of carrion. It comes to the ruins of the beloved's campsite after that beloved has gone, leaving only the poet to sort of ponder the raven and the absent beloved. And so I have a line here illustrating that from Qais ibn al-Munawwah, better known as Majnun Layla. "O pied crow, you've stirred my anguish. God have mercy on you. Tell me what it is that you shriek and cry about." Line 13, more astronomical imagery. So here we have tibaq between al-ʻAla, Nasr. So this is a northern hemisphere constellation, and Scorpio in the southern hemisphere, and also al-ʻAla, an eagle is a flying creature versus a scorpion that's a very sort of earthbound creature. Looking back at line 9, that was where we encountered Saturn and Alcor. The general sense of this line is that heaven is more powerless than Earth, and at least the Earth's eagles and scorpions can move. The stars are bound. Line 14, some sort of light jinas between sharaqat and mashraq. And also, you could think of this maybe as tibaq from the first, or maybe like kind of a transition from the last 4 lines, which talk about the night. The general sense here is that this world and its cares obscure what's true, just as the mist obscures the sun at dawn. Line 15, another erudite reference to 2 people that would have been known to Maʻarri, Socrates and Hippocrates, both through Arabic translation of Greek works, and also Maʻarri lived at the edges of Byzantium. So between those 2 sort of conduits, he would have been very familiar with their names at the very least. He also makes references to Galen in some of his works, defending his own practice of veganism, which we can talk about in Q&A if you want. Here the words I've rendered as well-wrought words are loves, and then the healer's art is tib. They could be general words, they could also be book references. So Aristotle's rhetoric is called khataba in Arabic. It wouldn't fit the meter, probably. And the works of Hippocrates have long names that probably wouldn't have fit this line. Are they references to specific books? Who knows? It was speculation. The general idea is the futility of healing, at least human capacity to heal, and also the futility even of speech, which I'm sure for Maʻarri would have been beautiful since he was a poet. Line 16. Maʻarri often speaks of himself as if he were already dead. and that is going on here. There's another line that I put up here from another Luzūmīyāt. I'm covered in earth by one loath to do so, when death's hateful stench does not leave me. And then a word that resonates with corpus of zuhd writings in general, which is amal. All who perish, all who hope will perish. The amalin is the Arabic word. And again, it's going back to the concept of qasar al-amal, short duration of hope in the world. Finally, rounding out the poem, is another janas on tabdhub and tadhib, and a possible reference, again speculation, to Zoroastrian dakhma. This is a practice of putting dead bodies up on a tower, exposing them to carrion to be carried off as kind of like expiration. It's part of the process of expiration. So to just conclude with two very brief comments. The first is that, the first is that Maʻarri writes about death in sort of a gloomy way, but again, the overall goal is to command a certain kind of attention. He wants us to pay attention to the life that we're living by thinking about the fact that it will end one day. So as grim as it gets, that implication is always there, and there's sort of a kind of hope, even if that hope comes at the end of his life. The second point I wanted to make is that Maʻarri cared very deeply about his own afterlife, not just in the theological sense of his soul carrying on after this life, but also his literary legacy, his literary afterlife, if you will. He wrote literally thousands of pages of Arabic. He appended commentaries to his own works, trying to help readers understand what he was doing, sometimes to obscure what he was doing, but often to help them along. It shows a deep care for what people would think of him after he was gone. And even just the fact that we're talking about his poetry today indicates that that work, that his legacy did live on, and that he'll continue to be relevant. Thank you.